When the Homeowners Association sent out its glossy pamphlets, it painted a picture of a neighborhood that was safe, orderly, and well-managed. The kind of place where children could play freely in the yards, where neighbors could leave doors unlocked, where parents could breathe without constant anxiety. There were promises of surveillance, of patrolling security, of quick responses to every complaint. Every statement was designed to reassure, to build trust, to make residents feel that they were part of a protected community. The language was careful, almost comforting. "Safety is our top priority," one line read. Another assured residents that any threat to well-being would be addressed immediately. At board meetings, the HOA leaders spoke with calm authority, outlining budgets for better lighting, neighborhood watch programs, and safety workshops. On paper, the infrastructure seemed unshakable. But paper and reality are rarely the same. Beneath the polished brochures and carefully timed meetings, there were cracks that few could see. Complaints about malfunctioning gate systems were ignored or dismissed as minor glitches. Requests for increased patrols were met with vague reassurances and promises to review the matter. Even when neighbors reported suspicious activity, the HOA's response was often delayed, minimal, or non-existent. Each promise, no matter how emphatically stated, seemed to dissolve when it came time for action. Residents began to notice that safety measures existed more as slogans than as actual protections. Cameras were installed, but in blind spots. Security guards were scheduled, but often left early or failed to monitor crucial areas. The very systems meant to protect the neighborhood became symbols of inaction. For the residents, this disconnect between promise and reality created a simmering tension. Many chose to ignore the small failures, rationalizing that mistakes happen, that no system is perfect. But when safety is involved, even small oversights carry weight. Parents walk the line between trust and fear, aware that the HOA's assurances might not translate into real-world protection. At first, the failures were subtle: a late response to a noise complaint, a missing patrol, a broken streetlight left unrepaired. Yet each small failure compounded, creating a sense that the neighborhood's safety was more of an illusion than a guarantee. The community meetings, designed to show accountability, became exercises in repetition, with the same promises echoing without tangible follow-through. Residents who spoke up about incidents were met with polite nods, reassured with phrases that sounded comforting but lacked substance. This growing gap between what was promised and what actually existed became a source of frustration and anxiety. Trust, once given freely, began to erode. Some neighbors tried to address issues individually, taking extra precautions for their families, while others attempted to rally collective action, urging the HOA to fulfill its own commitments. Yet the association's bureaucracy often slowed progress, with forms, approvals, and committee votes stretching timelines indefinitely. Every day, the discrepancy between the glossy image of protection and the lived reality became more glaring. Children still played near broken streetlights, security cameras remained blind to certain entrances, and suspicious activity sometimes went unnoticed until it was too late. The irony was sharp. The same association that promised constant vigilance had created a false sense of security, leaving families to operate under the assumption that safety measures were active when in reality, the system was fragile and inconsistent. Residents were left to navigate the tension between reliance on authority and personal responsibility, constantly questioning which threats would be addressed and which would slip through the cracks. The disparity was no longer an abstract concept. It was visible in the day-to-day experiences of families who felt that the safeguards were more symbolic than effective. It was in this environment that the true weight of promises versus reality became apparent. The HOA's assurances, once comforting, now felt hollow. Residents began documenting incidents meticulously, photographing neglected areas, logging times of delayed responses, and noting repeated oversights. Conversations between neighbors turned to accounts of near misses and small emergencies that escalated because the promised systems weren't functioning as intended. The emotional toll was tangible. What had been marketed as a haven of safety was, in practice, a neighborhood where vigilance fell to the residents themselves, where the authority figures who had pledged protection often failed to act. The chasm between promise and reality was not just a bureaucratic failing. It was a betrayal of trust. Every meeting, every memo, every brochure that had claimed a commitment to safety now stood in stark contrast to lived experiences of inaction and neglect. For some, the realization was gradual, an accumulation of disappointments and ignored warnings. For others, it was sudden, crystallized in a single incident that exposed the fragility of the system. The community was faced with a fundamental question. If the structures in place to protect them were unreliable, who would step in when the next threat emerged? Fear is an emotion that doesn't always announce itself in grand gestures. Often, it starts quietly, a subtle tightening in the chest, a glance over the shoulder, a lingering worry about what might happen when no one else is paying attention. For one mother in the neighborhood, that fear became a constant companion. It wasn't rooted in abstract statistics or distant headlines. It was deeply personal, tied directly to the life and safety of her child. Every news report, every anecdote about break-ins or assaults in nearby communities sharpened her awareness. She had read the HOA's pamphlets, attended the safety meetings, and listened to the promises of protection. On paper, her fears should have been manageable, tempered by the reassurance of a system designed to safeguard her family. But the reality she faced was far less comforting. The first signs of danger were subtle. Her child would come home a little shaken from walking past a dimly lit street, or mention an unfamiliar car parked too long near the playground. At first, she tried to rationalize, convincing herself that her imagination was exaggerating, that the neighborhood was still generally safe. But when small incidents began to pile up, suspicious people loitering, odd noises late at night, confrontations that neighbors later admitted they had witnessed but not reported, the rationalizations became harder to maintain. The mother realized that her concern was not paranoia. It was a response to an environment that, despite the HOA's assurances, was failing to protect the very residents it was supposed to serve. Every day became a balancing act between normalcy and vigilance. She had to let her child live, to attend school, to play outside, all while monitoring the neighborhood's pulse. She checked security cameras, made repeated calls to the HOA, and kept meticulous notes of every suspicious event. Each unanswered email or delayed response from the association amplified her anxiety. She began questioning the competence and priorities of those entrusted with safety. The promises that once reassured her, the patrolling guards, the neighborhood watch alerts, the quick response guarantees, felt increasingly hollow. The systems that were supposed to create security seemed designed more to project an image of safety than to ensure it. Fear, when constant, changes the way a person perceives the world. The mother noticed her own movements altering, double-checking locks multiple times, insisting on walking her child to school, avoiding certain areas after dark. She became hyper-aware of patterns, noting cars that appeared repeatedly without explanation, neighbors acting suspiciously, doors left open or unlocked. Her fear was no longer abstract. It dictated her daily routines, her conversations, her decisions. She felt isolated in a way that many parents experience when the safety net they rely on turns out to be unreliable. Others might dismiss her caution as overprotectiveness, but every observation, every intuition, told her that vigilance was essential. The emotional toll was significant. She felt frustration, anger, and helplessness alongside fear. Frustration at the HOA for failing to uphold the very promises that had convinced families to trust them. Anger at the neighborhood systems that ignored warnings until problems escalated. Helplessness because, despite her efforts, some threats could not be controlled or predicted. Sleep became irregular, her mind replaying scenarios in which she had to intervene or make split-second decisions to protect her child. Her fear was relentless, fueled not just by imagination, but by concrete instances where safety measures failed or proved insufficient. As time went on, fear evolved into resolve. She recognized that waiting for the HOA to act was no longer an option. The safety of her child, and by extension, the well-being of the entire family, depended on her taking responsibility. The same vigilance that once manifested as anxiety became strategic, documenting incidents, speaking to neighbors, learning what legal and practical avenues were available. She began to view her fear as a signal rather than a weakness, a guide to action rather than a paralyzing force. This transformation was not sudden. It was forged through countless nights of worry, mornings of tension, and the constant awareness that a failure in safety could have irreversible consequences. The mother's fear was deeply intertwined with her identity as a caregiver. It was a fear that demanded acknowledgement because it had real stakes. Unlike generic concerns about statistics or probabilities, her fear was anchored in her child's daily life, what they did, where they went, and who they might encounter. Every interaction with the neighborhood, every conversation with the HOA, every decision about routines was filtered through the lens of this fear. And in that fear, she found clarity. If protection was not coming from the authorities who promised it, it would have to come from her, informed by vigilance, intuition, and an unwavering commitment to her child's safety. Warning signs are rarely subtle once you know what to look for. At first, they appear almost innocuous: a car parked too long on a quiet street, a gate left unlocked, a faint noise in the distance. But when overlooked repeatedly, they begin to form a pattern that speaks louder than any spoken words. In this neighborhood, the early signs of danger were present, if only residents or the HOA had paid attention. The mother noticed them first: strange footprints near the playground, unusual strangers walking through areas marked as private property, and reports from neighbors about missing packages or minor thefts. Each incident alone could have been dismissed as coincidence, but together they formed a series of signals that screamed caution. She documented everything. Every irregularity, no matter how small, was noted in a growing ledger of concern. A neighbor mentioned a man loitering outside a home in the middle of the day. The mother wrote it down. A streetlight went out and remained unrepaired for weeks. She recorded it. An unlocked back gate was reported multiple times with no response. It was added to her notes. Each entry felt like a small thread in a larger tapestry, one that painted a troubling picture. The systems designed to protect the community were failing at the most basic level. And yet, the HOA meetings continued with their polished presentations, the board members offering reassurances that problems were being addressed, even when, in reality, nothing had been done. The mother tried to raise her concerns formally. She emailed the HOA, detailing every incident, every overlooked warning, every anomaly. She attended board meetings, standing before the association with her notes in hand, hoping to provoke action. But the response was often polite acknowledgement without meaningful change. "We're aware of the issues and are reviewing them," they said, a phrase repeated enough times that it lost all meaning. The lack of urgency was not just frustrating, it was dangerous. Each ignored warning sign increased the risk that something serious would happen, and she understood this instinctively. Neighbors began to share their own experiences, and a disturbing pattern emerged. Reports of suspicious activity, strange vehicles, and late-night disturbances had been dismissed or delayed in response. Some residents had tried to intervene themselves, while others resigned themselves to the idea that nothing would change. The collective frustration grew, but it lacked a clear outlet. The HOA's bureaucracy acted like a dam, filtering and slowing reports until the issues lost immediacy. By the time action was taken, or if it was ever taken, the moment for preventative measures had often passed. The mother saw this failure as more than inefficiency. It was negligence, a refusal to recognize that repeated warning signs were indicators of real danger. The psychological effect of ignored warnings was intense. The mother experienced a constant tension, a sense of walking on the edge. Each overlooked sign made her more alert, more watchful, but it also heightened her anxiety. She began to notice patterns others might miss. A stranger taking the same route multiple times, a door left unlocked in an unusual place, a neighbor reporting an odd smell or sound. She connected the dots where the HOA did not, seeing trends that were dismissed or minimized in official reports. This vigilance became exhausting, but necessary. Ignored warnings are not just failures of action. They are invitations for harm, and she could not allow her family to be the victims of inaction. The mother also had to contend with skepticism from others. Some residents implied that she was overreacting, that she was imagining patterns where none existed. The repetition of small incidents, the failure of the HOA to act, made her appear hypervigilant to casual observers. Yet she understood the difference between intuition informed by evidence and unwarranted fear. She knew that a pattern existed, and each ignored warning made the risk more concrete. The stakes were not hypothetical. They were personal, and every moment of inaction increased the chance that her fears could become reality. Despite the obstacles, she persisted. She spoke to local authorities, neighbors, and anyone who would listen, amplifying the ignored signals that had been left unheeded. She began to take preventive steps herself, locking gates manually, monitoring cameras, accompanying her child whenever possible, and documenting every irregularity in precise detail. The ignored warnings were no longer invisible. They became a roadmap for action, a guide that informed every decision she made. The failure of the HOA to respond only reinforced her resolve, showing that if protection was not coming from them, it would have to come from her own diligence, her own initiative. The danger of ignored warning signs is cumulative. Each small failure compounds, creating an environment where serious threats can emerge without detection. In this neighborhood, the mother recognized that the signs had been there all along, but they had been minimized, postponed, or dismissed. The HOA's promises of safety had masked these signs, lulling residents into a false sense of security. What remained was a reality where vigilance rested on the shoulders of those willing to see, document, and act. A mother determined to ensure that no warning went unheeded. Taking action is never easy, especially when the system that is supposed to protect you has failed. For this mother, it was clear that waiting for the homeowners association to respond would be a mistake she could not afford. Every ignored warning sign, every unanswered complaint, and every delayed response had led to one unavoidable conclusion. If she wanted her family to be safe, she would have to act herself. Action, in her mind, was no longer optional. It was a moral and practical necessity. She began by assessing the situation with the precision of someone mapping a battlefield. She reviewed every incident she had documented, noting patterns of neglect, the timing of failures, and the specific areas where safety measures had lapsed. Each entry in her log told a story of risk compounded by inaction, and she treated those stories not as complaints, but as a blueprint for intervention. This process was painstaking, but she understood that effective action required understanding the problem completely. She could not rely on assumptions or hope. She needed facts, evidence, and strategy. Her first steps were small but deliberate. She repaired security measures where she could, installing additional locks, reinforcing gates, and ensuring that cameras provided real coverage of vulnerable areas. She coordinated with neighbors to form informal patrols, creating a network of people who would watch over each other in ways the HOA had promised but never delivered. She shared her findings openly, creating awareness in the community without inciting panic, emphasizing that safety was now a collective responsibility. This approach was tactical as much as it was emotional. She knew that action without organization could be chaotic, but organized effort could transform fear into tangible protection. Legal measures also became part of her strategy. She researched local ordinances, property rights, and liability laws, preparing herself to challenge the HOA if necessary. Every loophole she discovered was another tool to ensure accountability. She contacted law enforcement when appropriate, providing them with detailed records of past incidents that the HOA had neglected. She approached each step methodically, understanding that strong action required not just instinct and courage, but also careful documentation and adherence to rules. The mother realized that her initiative needed to be credible, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. Emotionally, Taking action required a recalibration of fear into determination. The anxiety that had previously kept her awake at night was now transformed into a driving force. Every patrol she organized, every lock she reinforced, every phone call she made to authorities became a manifestation of her commitment to protect her child. Action was empowering, but it was also exhausting. She had to navigate the fine line between vigilance and obsession, ensuring that her efforts were effective without letting the constant pressure consume her entirely. In doing so, she discovered resilience she had not realized she possessed. One of the most challenging aspects of taking action was confronting the HOA directly. Meetings that had once been polite exchanges of complaints became arenas for demanding accountability. She presented her documentation with clarity and precision, highlighting not just the failures, but also the risks that those failures created. She questioned leadership decisions, demanded timelines, and insisted on transparency. The mother's approach was firm but measured. She understood that anger alone would not compel change, but well-structured evidence paired with relentless persistence could. She became a force that could not be dismissed, a presence that reminded the HOA that promises had consequences. At the same time, she continued to focus on her family's immediate safety. Adjustments to daily routines, monitoring of vulnerable spaces, and preparation for emergencies became part of the household's rhythm. Action was not abstract. It was physical, logistical, and constant. Her child noticed the change too, not as fear, but as a sense that someone was actively protecting them, someone whose vigilance was uncompromising. This transformation of fear into proactive effort also gave her confidence in her own ability to influence events. It was no longer a matter of waiting and hoping. She was shaping the reality of safety through deliberate steps. Action, she realized, also had a ripple effect. Neighbors who had previously been passive began to engage. Some joined her patrols, others took steps to improve security on their own properties, and conversations about safety became more than casual chatter. They became plans, commitments, and shared responsibilities. The mother's initiative created momentum, showing that when leadership fails, determined individuals can step in to protect their own communities. Her actions demonstrated that accountability does not always arrive from institutions. Sometimes, it comes from those with the courage to confront failure directly. With each day, each measure taken, and each conversation held, the mother's path of action became clearer. She was no longer just a worried parent. She was a strategist, an organizer, and a protector, transforming anxiety into concrete steps that made her family and neighborhood safer. Justice, in this story, did not arrive with the polite assurances of the homeowners association or the hollow promises of bureaucrats. It arrived through the determination, courage, and relentless effort of a single mother who refused to allow her family's safety to be compromised any longer. After months of warnings ignored, complaints dismissed, and risks minimized, she transformed her fear and vigilance into decisive action that held the system and the people responsible accountable. What unfolded was a combination of strategy, courage, and moral clarity that turned neglect into consequences. Her pirouette of justice began by consolidating all the evidence she had gathered over months. Every late-night disturbance, every broken gate, every suspicious vehicle, every delayed HOA response was meticulously logged. She compiled photographs, recorded communications, and documented eyewitness accounts from neighbors who had witnessed events the association refused to act upon. This was not just a collection of grievances. It was an irrefutable record of negligence. She knew that to confront the HOA and any responsible parties effectively, she needed more than anger or emotion. She needed facts that could not be dismissed, a case built from the reality she had painstakingly recorded. With the documentation in hand, she approached local authorities and legal advisors, presenting a clear narrative of systemic failure. She showed how promises had been made but not kept, how warnings had been issued but ignored, and how these lapses created genuine danger for the residents. Each document, each photograph, each detailed account added weight to her claim. She was no longer a parent hoping someone else would act. She was a credible agent of accountability, armed with evidence that demanded attention. Her preparation forced the authorities to take notice, and for the first time, the inertia of bureaucracy began to move. The mother's confrontation with the HOA was deliberate and unrelenting. Board meetings, which had previously been exercises in polite dismissal, became arenas where her presence and preparation could not be ignored. She presented her evidence systematically, highlighting patterns of neglect and connecting them directly to the risks faced by residents. Questions were no longer rhetorical or polite. They were pointed, demanding explanations that the association had no ready answers for. She challenged the leadership's decisions, exposed inconsistencies in their policies, and held them accountable for the consequences of their inaction. It was a demonstration of power rooted in truth. When confronted with undeniable evidence, the veneer of authority and control that the HOA had relied upon began to crack. Justice also manifested through tangible outcomes. Safety measures that had been promised but ignored were finally implemented under her supervision and insistence. Broken gates were repaired, cameras repositioned, and patrol schedules enforced. Policies were rewritten, and accountability measures established to prevent future neglect. The mother ensured that these actions were not symbolic. They were functional, verifiable, and documented. The HOA could no longer claim ignorance or inefficiency. Every step taken had her fingerprints on it, a reminder that vigilance and persistence can enforce consequences where promises alone fail. Her actions had an impact beyond the immediate safety measures. Neighbors who had once been passive began to speak up, inspired by the demonstration that change was possible when someone refused to accept neglect. Community members began taking responsibility for one another, reinforcing the idea that justice is not just an abstract concept enforced by authorities, but a principle realized through engagement, courage, and accountability. The mother's pursuit of justice became a catalyst, reshaping the neighborhood culture and embedding a sense of collective responsibility that had been absent. Emotionally, delivering justice required confronting fear directly. She had feared for her child's safety, feared that her efforts would be ignored, feared the backlash of challenging entrenched authority. But in transforming fear into action, she discovered that justice was not only about consequences for wrongdoing. It was about reclaiming a sense of security, restoring trust, and affirming that negligence cannot go unchecked. Every meeting, every phone call, every follow-up action reinforced the principle that accountability is earned, not assumed, and that real protection comes from those willing to fight for it. This form of justice was not immediate. It required persistence, patience, and resilience. The mother learned to navigate obstacles with strategy rather than emotion, to insist without aggression, and to hold the system accountable in ways that could not be ignored or deflected. She understood that justice, when delivered effectively, leaves no loopholes, no room for excuses, and no gaps in protection. It demands evidence, strategy, and the courage to act even when others have failed. Ultimately, justice was the result of a parent refusing to allow promises to remain empty words, refusing to let neglect define the safety of her family, and refusing to accept the authorities' inertia as inevitable. It was a calculated, determined, and courageous response to systemic failure, one that demonstrated that accountability can be enforced when vigilance meets action, and that one determined individual can create consequences where promises alone fall short. The story of one mother's fight for safety is more than a single act of courage. It carries lessons that ripple across an entire community. When promises fail, when warnings go ignored, and when accountability is absent, it falls to individuals to recognize gaps and take responsibility. The neighborhood learned, sometimes painfully, that relying solely on institutions, no matter how authoritative or polished their messaging, can leave residents vulnerable. These lessons are not abstract. They are rooted in real consequences, and they demand reflection and action from everyone who calls a community home. One of the clearest lessons is that vigilance matters. The mother's ability to identify warning signs and take proactive measures highlighted how important it is for community members to pay attention to their surroundings. Safety is not passive. It requires awareness, observation, and the courage to question things that seem off. The residents realized that ignoring small anomalies, unattended vehicles, broken locks, or unusual activity can allow danger to grow unchecked. Even well-intentioned policies and security systems are ineffective if no one is actively monitoring or reinforcing them. Vigilance became not a burden but a necessary responsibility, a collective shield that could prevent tragedies before they happen. Another lesson is that action carries power. Complaining, hoping, or relying solely on authorities is insufficient when immediate risk is involved. The mother's example demonstrated that deliberate, informed action can create real change, even in the face of institutional inertia. Documenting incidents, organizing neighbors, coordinating with law enforcement, and insisting on accountability were all forms of action that led to tangible results. The community saw that waiting for problems to resolve themselves or assuming that someone else would intervene is dangerous. Empowerment comes from knowing what steps to take and committing to follow through, even when the system seems unresponsive. Communication also emerged as a crucial lesson. The mother's efforts to share her observations and coordinate with neighbors highlighted how information strengthens safety. A community that communicates openly about concerns, patterns, and incidents can act collectively rather than individually, making interventions more effective. Silence or inaction, even when motivated by a desire to avoid conflict, allows risks to persist unnoticed. The residents learned that sharing information, raising alarms, and maintaining transparency are not signs of paranoia. They are essential tools for collective security. Trust, too, was reevaluated. The HOA had built trust through promises, but the failure to deliver demonstrated that trust must be earned continuously, not assumed. The community understood that accountability is not just about policies or contracts. It is about results, follow-through, and responsiveness. When institutions fail to uphold their commitments, residents must be prepared to step in, question authority, and demand evidence that systems are actually working. Trust becomes conditional on action, and the residents learned that blind reliance on authority without verification can have dangerous consequences. The story also underscored the importance of preparation. The mother had prepared for contingencies, documenting evidence, learning legal options, monitoring systems, and planning proactive measures. Her preparation allowed her to act decisively when others hesitated. The lesson for the community is that readiness is a form of prevention. Knowing how to respond, understanding available resources, and having clear plans for potential scenarios empowers individuals and families to handle threats effectively. Preparedness reduces fear, enhances response times, and ensures that when action is necessary, it is swift and effective rather than reactive and chaotic. A final lesson is the power of example. One individual's courage and determination can inspire collective responsibility. The mother's persistence encouraged neighbors to engage in ways they had not before, monitoring shared spaces, reporting incidents promptly, and participating in community safety initiatives. Her actions created a culture shift, showing that accountability is contagious and that proactive engagement strengthens the entire neighborhood. Communities learn through observation, and seeing one person act decisively often motivates others to take responsibility, reinforcing collective safety and vigilance. These lessons, taken together, form a blueprint for any community seeking to ensure the well-being of its residents. They highlight the necessity of awareness, action, communication, preparation, accountability, and example. They also reveal the cost of inaction. Each ignored warning, each unaddressed failure, and each empty promise carries consequences that affect everyone. The neighborhood came to understand that safety is not just a system or a policy. It is a practice, a mindset, and a shared responsibility that requires both courage and consistency. Communities must internalize that institutions alone cannot guarantee protection. Systems can fail, people can neglect their duties, and promises can remain unfulfilled. The residents learned that the real safeguard lies in collective engagement, where each person contributes to monitoring, reporting, and reinforcing security measures. This lesson extends beyond any single incident or neighborhood. It is universal. The story emphasizes that vigilance, informed action, and accountability are not optional. They are essential elements of living in a shared space where the safety of all depends on the commitment of each individual.